Hey there, I'm Dr. Barbara Woods with Resilience-Based Psychotherapist, and I am going to talk to you today about the top 3 difficulties in therapy that are related to the complex trauma that we're working with when we have children, but they're the complex trauma of the parents. So in our profession, we try our hardest to support our clients when we consider the amount of pain and the generations of pain that they've walked through. We know that they're doing the best that they can with the resources that they've got. So the skills that they have may have been passed down for generations and may not be the most effective skills for supporting the parent-child relationship. But we have to believe that they are doing the best that they can with what they've got. And we have to make significant changes to support that parent-child relationship. So I'm going to go through these top 3. The first one is individual therapy for children or teens. When you get a referral, may come from a doctor, a school, a social worker, might be the parent themselves, but they've identified the child as needing therapy. So those are what referrals typically are for children because they have behavioral problems or emotional concerns. So that's what we get kind of drawn into, is dealing with those emotional and behavioral concerns. But when we only treat the child and provide therapy for the child or teen, we're putting all the pressure on these little people to heal generations of trauma and to correct the parent-child relationship. So if we aren't engaging the parents and supporting the parents to learn new skills and even heal their own complex trauma, we're putting a lot of pressure on children and teens. And this is problematic because it reinforces the parents' belief that this child or this teen needs to be fixed. And if you're a therapist working with children and teens, you've probably had a parent say, you need to fix this kid. And they're frustrated and they kind of don't know what to do. And that should be a red flag and should cue you in that there's some tension in this parent-child relationship and there might be some intergenerational trauma. So this is a problem because the behavior they want fixed is on the surface. So if you think of it like an iceberg, it's up in this area of the iceberg where we have to support parents to understand that there's things down beneath the water and the surface that we need to address. And then the behavior, what we see, will shift or change. So this prevents, if we only do individual therapy with a child or teen, it prevents the parent from understanding how their complex trauma may have some negative impacts on the child or teen. So another thing, the child may really enjoy therapy and make progress, but they may also have negative self-beliefs that there's something wrong with them, because in families with intergenerational trauma, there's usually difficulties in attachment in the parent-child relationship. And up until about age 7, kids are very self-referential and they think they don't have the capacity to fact check when when they're thinking about themselves or recognizing patterns. It just recognizes the pattern. So if I was loud, mom yelled at me, I'm a bad kid. So this is those early negative self-beliefs that then they just kind of go under the surface. They become really implicit, but they drive a lot of behavior. So if we're only doing therapy with the child, we're kind of feeding into that negative self-belief that there's something wrong with the child. Even if they have behavioral problems, they're probably behaving exactly as we would expect for the situations that they're under. So when a family is, again, impacted by intergenerational trauma, these negative self-beliefs can be back in generations. They can kind of be transmitted through interactions and difficult situations. So it's really important to ensure that we're supporting the child, but also supporting the parent. So the negative beliefs, they're part of the legacy of intergenerational trauma, and they'll interfere with the parent-child relationship, friendships, has to do later in life with ability to do well at work and in school, the relationships that they get in. So these negative self-beliefs are really important to consider when you're working with people who are impacted by intergenerational trauma. Another difficulty with doing individual therapy for the child or teen is that when we don't engage parents, it significantly limits the outcomes of therapy. And there's a very low ceiling of progress. There's a limit because we're not involving the parents, and kids and teens, they rely on their parents a lot. So this happens because there's no change in the caregiver's interactions, behaviors, or the family system that supports the progress and maintains the gains. So sometimes you'll see very limited gains or progress, or you'll see it'll work for a while and then they'll kind of slide back into old behaviors. And this may be why, is that if we're not changing the way that these children are parented and supporting the parents to develop positive self-beliefs and a positive parent-child relationship, this can be really, really difficult, and it really kind of stagnates progress. So once we can support parents to understand the influences underneath that behavior, so the everything below the water of the iceberg, and to develop the skills to address these influences, they have a whole new set of skills that they may have never had before that helps them in the parent-child relationship. So that's where parental engagement in the process, even if the child is of most concern or kind of the identified client, it's really important to engage the parents. But there's a caveat. The number 2 top difficulty is that it's very difficult to engage parents in the therapy process, or sometimes with greater intergenerational impacts, they may actually even sabotage therapy. So this usually happens when there's much more intense impacts of intergenerational trauma on the parent and more degrees of complex trauma within the parent. So their parents and caregivers can find it difficult to engage in therapy for a number of reasons. Some of them may be practical, that they're single parent, they're working, and they can't afford to take time off work. They may not have transportation, so they have somebody else bring the child. So there's some practical concerns, but it could also be avoidance due to discomfort or fear in the presence of a therapist. Like, some people feel like therapists can read your mind, right? If you go around them, they're going to know what's going on inside of you, and you can't interact with them. But they may really want their child to get the help and support. So they'll support that individual therapy for the child, but they'll avoid or feel discomfort around the whole therapy process. So they have excellent intentions for their child to get therapy and heal, but they're also fearful in the process or of the therapist. So a lack of awareness of how important that parent-child relationship can also be a reason that it's difficult to engage them in therapy. They may be doing far better than their parents or whoever raised them. If they experienced physical abuse in their own childhood, they're not using physical discipline, but they may be yelling, shaming. They feel like they're doing better. So they're not aware of some of the strategies they're using that may not be effective and may make the problems worse because they're doing better than what they experienced. So therapists also avoid parents because it can be uncomfortable or difficult to engage them. So sometimes if it's too hard to get them engaged in therapy. Sometimes it's just work with the child and do the best that you can. So, parental involvement may range from just avoidance, but they can also become hostile towards the therapist, towards the child, towards the therapy process. So, again, you'll find more hostility and you'll find greater impacts on the therapy process with the more intergenerational impacts and complex trauma that the parent is experiencing. So, some things that may cause the therapist to be uncomfortable is sometimes these parents are they are demanding that you fix this kid. This has to change, and this can really shut down the therapeutic interaction. It's a really kind of inappropriate expectation to we're not mechanics. We deal with human problems and it's not like there's a fix. So it can really shut down the therapy interaction, and this is especially for people who are newer in the field. Sometimes these parents can be really overbearing and can make the therapist quite uncomfortable. There can also be defensiveness of some parents that are impacted that can also be difficult to manage. We have to remember that this defensiveness, this aggression, this demanding behavior, it's an autonomic nervous system state. This is a sympathetic response that's more likely fight, might have a little bit of flight mixed in there, but we have to see this from that lens so that we can actually support the parent as well. So it can be difficult to engage the parent in the presence of the child because they may be very negative towards the child. They may be negative towards you as the therapist. They may be negative about therapy in general. So it gets really hard to kind of balance that out. So what can happen is eventually the therapist can get really blindsided if the parent's complex trauma is triggered in the presence of the therapist in therapy, or if what the child's doing is in therapy has triggered the parent's complex trauma. So you may find when this happens, when parents get triggered, they may have a lack of respect for therapy. It's just, you're just playing little games and not doing anything. So they may not respect the process. They sometimes are so against play therapy and art therapy or any kind of crafts that have kind of some therapeutic significance. We've had parents that we've done these safe places where we take like a little tin or a little container and put in the Easter grass and put a little animal in there, and then we talk about what this animal needs to feel safe. Then we expand that to what do you need to feel safe. And so they come out, they show the parent the safe place, and they talk about it, and the parent might say, that's a frog in grass, like that's just Easter grass. So they're not really respecting what we're doing in therapy. The other thing is they can get somewhat angry that when the child comes to therapy, you do these activities, the child enjoys it, they have fun, they develop a good relationship with the therapist. That this really triggers them too. They just get angry that therapy is fun and that we're engaging and that we're not having trouble with the child's behavior. So another thing that may blindside the therapist is they may try to control the therapy process. So they may not approve of the interventions. They may give a lot of friction. Their referral source, especially if they're involved in a child welfare system, they may complain about therapy because they're not okay with play therapy or things like that. So you'll see this with parents wanting absolutely no aggressive play, no violent toys, and no roughness with toys. So they'll just not want any kind of expression of aggression. But there's a huge problem with that because these kids, if they're expressing it, It's in there. So if a therapist kind of colludes with the parent and doesn't allow the child a safe space to express this, it's more likely to pop up at school and family. So the aggressive play in therapy, it's actually okay. But what they get worried about is that if the child's had behavioral problems or if they feel like the child's out of control, um, they feel like aggressive play, violent toys like guns or soldiers, things like that, or being rough with toys is going to spill over into the home. Usually it might spike a little bit at first, but usually over time, once they've dealt with and processed that aggression, it goes away. So, two additional things that the parent may do that blindsides the therapist is they make negative comments about the therapist in front of the child. So, they may critique your therapy, they may express dissatisfaction, but they can be really negative and somewhat hostile about it. Again, that's with more intergenerational impacts. They may also make negative comments about the child in front in with about the child to the therapist, but it's in front of the child. So they may say something like, this therapy isn't working, he's still really out of control. Or they might make other comments that are kind of, they feed those negative self beliefs for the child, and it can get really uncomfortable to balance out the needs of the child and the difficulty that the parent is experiencing. So they may say things like, therapy isn't working, he's been horrible this week, I'm done with this kid. And again, we need to look at this as a sympathetic fight response. They're activated, they're going to come out and kind of fight verbally with people that are kind of associated with what they're frustrated with. So in some cases, the parents will look like they have really transcended their own complex intergenerational trauma. They will have gone through therapy. They may have other healing that it may blindside the therapist when they don't support these interventions or when they become more in a hostile type of interaction. So why this happens is they may have worked on their trauma symptoms. So they may have worked on their autonomic reactivity, dealing with triggers, dealing with just coping in general, nightmares, all those kinds of things. But they haven't dealt with the finer impacts of trauma on relationships. So this can be really difficult because these are what's impacting the parent-child relationship. And they get highly triggered by kids. Kids are triggering in general anyway. They will ride our last nerve on a good day because they're kids. That's what they're supposed to do. But when you have intergenerational patterns where the parent thinks they're doing better, they've healed their own trauma, they're giving their child a different experience, and they're still annoying or irritating, that becomes very frustrating for the parent, and they may really blindside the therapist. So this is partly a difficulty with intergenerational trauma because people may believe that healing is a completed process. I'm done with that. It's behind me. But there's so many layers, especially with intergenerational trauma. So these parents are usually the ones that blindside the therapist with their anger or defensive responses. And it might come out of the blue, but it's actually the autonomic reactivity of the parent. So the third top difficulty is that the parent can actually become jealous of the therapeutic relationship. So parents with complex trauma, they sometimes have difficulties in relationships in general. They think they're doing better than the previous generation, but they're still having trouble in the parent-child relationship. And deep down, they want to do better. They want to have a strong relationship with their child, But those intergenerational impacts really complicate that process. So they may engage in very subtle or very overt attempts to kind of sabotage therapy. So, how this can look is relatively minor things. They might kind of roll their eyes, like, you want me to do what kind of thing, just kind of in a lack of genuine interest. So, they might be, okay, we need to get going. I can't do this right now. Um, so, it can range from there. Again, they may throw away therapeutic crafts, like if you do mind jars, those safe places, or artwork. These kids put their like their safety in these things in that we make in therapy, and they have a lot of meaning for them. Like some of the mind jars, when we put the glitter in, we talk about, like, this is for feeling angry, and I get angry about this and this, and this is my grief because I'm missing my parents, or I'm missing somebody who's passed away. That when they throw these crafts away without kind of partnering and having it used its purpose, like, I don't feel like people should keep a scrap box of everything that's made in therapy until the child's 30 years old either. But it has to be done with the child, and the child has to be ready to let that item go. But you'll find that they'll just throw these crafts and these therapeutic interventions, they'll just throw them away. They may also, if there's been a negative interaction with the parent and the child, the parent, if you work on it with the child in the session and they understand that they need to make some changes, or they need to do some things, they've down regulated, they're more in a social engagement, or they feel safe or calm, the parent may still be activated in that sympathetic response, or they may be more in like a blue pathway, or that dorsal, or kind of numb and checked out. They may block attempts for the child to repair. I've seen parents where the child comes out and says, I want to talk to you about this. This is what I was thinking at the time. I'm really sorry. And the parent will go, I am not doing this right now. I'm not ready for you to apologize. So that's another indicator that you're dealing with some really deep issues there. They may make negative comments like, why don't you go cry to your therapist about this, when they get in conflict or when something happens. So there can be overt hostility and disrespect towards the therapist about interventions, the therapy process, attendance, how often they need to come, and maybe even a lack of progress because they're going to want relief right away. So if we aren't engaging the parents, we don't have a way to continually assess these impacts of intergenerational trauma. And you'll find that they will pop up as you go through the therapy process. They don't show all of a sudden, they will pop up. So we need to be continuously kind of monitoring for the impacts of intergenerational trauma on the parent. We also aren't able to provide psychoeducation or coaching regarding parenting skills or strategies. So that's another really difficult thing. And parental engagement is really best when it's a natural part of therapy. It's explained at intake, so they're not like being called in after an incident happens. It's just built right into the process. So they're expected to participate. You have to build that relationship with the parents as well. So we want to address some of the potential impacts of intergenerational trauma right from the beginning of therapy. So we may say something to the parent like, we aren't parenting. We're not trying to get the child to clean their room, to not fight with their siblings, to get up and go to school. We're not parenting. So the relationship is very different. And they won't show those behaviors with us, but we can transfer that positive interaction and help them develop the skills, help support the parents to have the skills in order to have a better relationship. But we really have to make it clear to them, we're not parenting, so this relationship is going to look like it really quick, easy, very happy, very healthy relationship, but it's because we're therapists. They may need education regarding therapy with children, how play is working out their problems, that we'd rather see aggression in a playroom than out on the playground. The other thing we need to do is follow a structured, systematic process for a number of reasons. It engages the parent to develop their own skills. It supports them to identify and address their own complex trauma in a very gentle, supportive way. And it uses a framework that provides the parent with some positive leadership. They need to be in a position where they feel empowered as a parent and that they can do things about what's happening rather than all this stuff in the parent-child relationship happening to them. And we want to help them develop some new parenting skills. So if we use consistent strategies between the parents, the children or teen, and they are consistent with both the parent and teen, it's a much more efficient therapy process. So I do this with polyvagal theory, relational neuroscience. So you have similar language, similar interventions, but they're tailored to the age and the needs of each individual that we're working with. So that's exactly what I've done with my intergenerational trauma program. It's an efficient and effective system of interventions that first it looks at calming the family nervous system. So it really helps get in there, support the parent to understand trauma, attachment, the nervous system, so that they have a wider variety of positive parenting skills. It addresses the complex trauma of the parent. It addresses the trauma of the child or teen, and it also builds family resistance and further supports attachment. So those are your top 3 difficulties in therapy. I appreciate you taking the time to watch this, and I hope the content will give you some things to consider when you're working with families who are impacted by intergenerational trauma. So I will see you next week, and we'll keep diving deeper into intergenerational trauma. Have a beautiful day.